And so the whole figure means of itself so. And we should give the rough English equivalent of that as spontaneity. That which happens of itself, just in the same way, for example, that your hair is growing by itself, your heart is beating by itself, so that if you feel your pulse, you get this funny sensation of movement going on inside your body, and you think, I'm not doing that. That's something queer going on inside me over which I have no control. But when you come to think of it, what is more fundamental? What is more central to you? What is more the very middle of yourself than your own heart? And so this idea of nature, that which happens of itself so, is a process which is fundamentally not under our control, which is happening all on its own, just as our breathing is happening all on its own, and just as our heart beating is happening all on its own. And the fundamental thought of Taoist philosophy is that this self-so process has to be trusted. If you turn now to Confucian ideas, we will find another word that represents the basis of human nature. This word, written like this, has a funny pronunciation. Although when we Romanize this word in English, we spell it J-E-N, it's pronounced Rön. Sort of like rolling an R, or rather saying R but not rolling it. And this word is the cardinal virtue in the whole system of Confucian morality. It's usually translated human-heartedness or humanness. But when Confucius was asked to give a precise definition of it, he refused. He said, you have to feel the meaning of this virtue. You must never put it into words. And the wisdom of his attitude about not defining Yuan is simply this, that a human being is always greater than anything he can say about himself and anything he can think about himself. If we formulate ideas about our own nature, about how our own minds and emotions work, those ideas are always going to be qualitatively inferior, that is to say, far less complicated, far less alive than the actual author of the ideas themselves, and that is us. So there's something about ourselves which we can never get at, which we can never define, in just the same way that you can't bite your own teeth, you can't, without the aid of a mirror, look into your own eyes, you can't hear your own ears, and you can't make your own hand catch hold of itself. So that you must basically trust this. Confucius would say he would rather trust human passions and instincts than he would sometimes trust human ideas about what is right. For example, when people go to war, they very often go to war about who has the right ideology, who has the right of this particular dispute, and who has the wrong of it. And because there can be no agreement, no compromise between principles of right and wrong, ideological wars generally tend to be vastly destructive. On the other hand, when we go to war for simple, ordinary greed, because I am greedy of another people, of another nation, I want to carry off their goods, I want to carry off their women, I will at least be sure in going to war with them that I don't destroy the thing I want to possess. And so, if we are then bound to trust our own nature, this attitude of hands off, of not interfering with oneself beyond a certain point, is called, again in Lao Tzu's Taoist philosophy, this: Wu, Wei. This character means no, not, or don't. And it's said to have been originally based on a picture of bunches of grass tied together like this, indicating that a certain area is taboo. You mustn't step on this area. The ground is sacred. So don't, keep off, is its meaning. And it's possible that this was originally a drawing of a hand over a bird. Like this. So the meaning of this is grasping a bird. The whole idea is don't grasp the bird. In other words, don't clutch at what is living. If, for instance, you, like sometimes little children, pick up a kitten, and they're so eager to hold the kitten that they squeeze it tightly, and the kitty says, "No, no," and scratches the child all over the place. It's because he is loving it, he is grasping it too tightly. And so in the same way, we have to allow all living things to let go and manage themselves. Look, supposing if in drawing I wanted to be absolutely certain that my hand didn't go away from a line, and I began to get anxious. Is it going to go straight? And so let's bring in this hand to hold on to it. And let's send this one straight. But now how can I be sure my left hand's going to stay still? Maybe the right one will have to catch hold of it. And then we're in a total mess. But you see, we in the West are basically afraid that if we trust our own nature, everything will turn into chaos. We're afraid, as it were, not to keep holding a club over our heads, to keep watching on our instincts and our passions and our so-called uncivilized animal natures, fearing that they will go awry. But you know, when you let go of that grip on yourself, sometimes astounding things happen. You get out of your own light. You're functioning altogether in one piece. I mean, after all, a person who is basically divided against himself, who is in inner conflict and is trying to go in two directions at once, he can't go anywhere. He just has to sit and dither. Whereas if I'm going all in one direction, then at least I'm going. And even if I'm going in the wrong way, I can change the direction. But if I'm trying to go in two ways at once, I don't get anywhere at all. Now, artists in the Far East have made a great deal of what they call the controlled accident. Marvelous things which happen as surprises when an artist does not try to dominate his medium, but let his medium itself do some of the work. Take, for example, this cigarette jar that I have here. You see the glaze has just been slopped on it with a swift motion of the wrist. And do you notice, as I turn it, that there are all sorts of little flecks of white inside the black outline there. And little flecks of black, like right here, outside the main band of black. It's incidental things like this which to the Chinese and Japanese mind, and increasingly to our own way of thinking, make the real beauty of things. For instance, consider a shell like this. Here is an object which any one of you would pick up on the beach if you saw it. And yet, what does it represent? If you saw a painting with markings on like that, you might say, well, that's not what I call a painting. It doesn't look like anything. And yet, as I say, none of you would hesitate to pick that up and treasure it if you found it. For it, too, like the jar, is a sort of controlled accident. And it is the art of trusting the medium to express itself along with your own contribution to it as an artist. When this harmonious relationship of man and nature is brought into play, we get marvelous little objects of this kind. And so in the same way, if we can learn to trust our own nature, we will, I think, be profoundly surprised that things don't go out of control at all, but on the contrary, suddenly come back into control. Take, for example, a very familiar instance. Supposing you're learning to ride a bicycle. Some of you will have known that when you started out this rather difficult art, you found yourself immediately falling over, and your first instinct was to turn the wheel right opposite the direction in which you were falling. And in this way you collapsed totally on the ground. It seemed to be common sense to turn away from the direction in which you were falling, and yet the thing you have to learn to do is to turn the wheel in the direction in which you are falling, and in this way you suddenly come up straight again and you're in control. You expected to fall. You went with the fall, and you came to yourself again. In precisely the same way, when we go with our own nature, our own inner feelings, we come into control of them. We don't lose control. If we fight them, we get in that state of balled upness, of anxiety, of dither, which makes us incapable of doing anything at all. An anxiety and a dither which is comparable to the whole problem of maintaining freedom in a world like ours. The problem that we are in danger of losing our freedom through being over-anxious to preserve it. Or think of another illustration. Those of you who live in the East and the Middle West are familiar every winter with the problems of icy roads. But any good driver knows that when you skid on an icy road, you have to turn in the direction of your skid and not against your skid. That again brings you into control. To fight the trend of things, to fight what the Chinese call the Tao, the T-A-O, the way of nature, is to come into conflict with nature so that you can't do anything at all. Or another common example, everybody who ever used a sailing boat knows that if you are going to move, you've got to keep the wind in your sails. Even if you want to go against the wind, you would never dream of turning the boat directly into the path of the wind. So you always have in some way to keep the wind behind you, but when you want to go against the wind, you don't fight the wind, you use the wind. You, in other words, tack against it at an angle, so that it blows you into itself. And this is the fundamental principle of Chinese philosophy, which underlies that startling manifestation of it in Japanese wrestling called judo, where you overcome the enemy not by opposing him, but by using his own strength to bring about his downfall. For this is the philosophy of bend and survive, of the strength of weakness, as the willow trees under snow go supple and drop the snow, but the pine with its tough branch piles up the snow and cracks.